way that it's laid out overall, the way that the phrases combine together into larger sections, and the sections build on each other to create a coherent shape to the piece overall. That form tends to be especially clear in this music, especially easy to follow. And in fact, Charles Rosen, who literally wrote the book on the classical style, writes that in no other style of music do the parts and the whole mirror each other with such clarity. So it's very easy to follow the form in this music. But how do listeners do that? How do they hear the form? In other words, what are the signposts that the composers put up to enable the listener to know where they are in the piece and have some sense of what may or may not happen next? Well, one of the most important ways that composers do this is through what we call themes, which is to say, little melodies that are unique to the piece and are very recognizable and that come back at certain moments. And we see a great example of this in what we call rondo, the most common forms in the classical style, and it's based on the idea of a single theme getting stated at the beginning of the piece and then coming back again and again throughout the movement. Beethoven's Opus 51, number 1, in C major, which is on the program tonight, is in rondo form. It begins with an A theme. That goes on for a while and then is followed by a contrasting B theme. Then after a while longer, the A theme comes back. That goes on for a while, and then we get a C theme that contrasts with both the A theme and the B theme. And then after that plays out, the movement ends with a final statement of A. So that's one case where the entirety of the form is signaled by the themes themselves. Rondo form, very common form in the classical style, and a number of the pieces on the program tonight are written in rondo form. The second number from Opus 51 is in rondo form. The fourth movement of the D major piano sonata is a rondo, and the second and third movements of the Pathetique sonata are written in rondo form. Very common. But things aren't always that simple in this style of music. And there are a number of cases where themes go missing. You don't have the themes to grab onto to signal, to know where you are in the music. And a good example of this comes in what we call sonata form, which is another really common form in this style. And a little bit more complicated. We have three main sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation, with the exposition dividing into two halves that each feature their own theme. The first movement of the Pathetique sonata is in sonata form, and these are the snippets of the two themes. So another really common form in the classical style, the first movement of the D major piano sonata is also in this form. So what happens here is that the two themes are stated in the exposition and they come back in the recapitulation. And so in those two sections, you can follow the form completely based on themes. The problem comes in the development section, which is the name would suggest is the portion of the sonata where the composer takes these themes and develops them, breaks them apart, and combines them in different ways. And you can't always count on the themes being there as sort of signals of where you are in the music at those points. So, very common situation. Like I said, the D major piano sonata first movement is in this form, and this is just one of many cases where you don't have themes there to tell you where you are in the music. So that's one problem with themes being the only way that you can tell where you are. The other problem is that we know, and I'm going to have to turn down the volume for this, but we know that people are able to hear the form in music even in the absence of themes. And there's actually some evidence of this. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine and I conducted a study where we took short snippets of popular songs. They're very short, on the order of a half a second. And we asked the subjects to tell us whether the snippets came from verses or from choruses. That's the form in popular music, just an alternation of verses and choruses. And I've got some examples of this. So we got 6 of these little snippets. You're welcome to play along. Some of them come from verses, some of them come from choruses. See if you can guess which ones are which. So that's what the subjects hear. And these are the answers to those 6 snippets. Half of them came from verses, half of them came from choruses. In case you're curious, all of those came from the song I'm a Believer by the Monkees. Now I'm a believer. That's the chorus, this is the verse. How'd you do? Well, it may be okay. Our subjects did okay. Our subjects, in fact, did better than okay, much better than you'd expect. They weren't perfect. They didn't get everyone right. But more often than not, they were able to tell us, based on those short snippets, whether they were in a verse or in a chorus. In other words, they were able to tell us where they were in the form, based on snippets of music that were far too short to contain a recognizable theme, or whatever the analog of a theme is in popular music. So people are able to hear this stuff even without themes. So how are they doing that? Well, it's probably partly a matter of themes. Certainly they help orient us to where we are in the music. But if you look at the music in the classical style, like we'll be hearing tonight, what you find is that the composers tend to build in all sorts of other musical signposts, other kinds of signals that tell us where we are in the music. And a number of these other signposts are based on principles of auditory perception. Now, these are things that the composers certainly didn't understand. They just kind of intuited them as they were writing the music, but they've since been studied very thoroughly by cognitive scientists, and we've come to a much clearer understanding of how these musical effects are working on a perceptual level. And I want to spend the rest of the time talking about some of these techniques that composers use to kind of leverage our auditory systems to help make it clear where we are in music. One of these techniques involves the number of melodies that are present in the music at a given point in time. And we see a good example of this in the first movement of the Pathetique Sonata, which is on the program tonight. Like I said before, this is in sonata form, meaning it starts with an exposition section that divides in half, has an A theme, followed by a B theme. And what we see at the beginning of the B theme is a really important formal boundary. This is the dividing line between the first half of the exposition and the second half. And if you want the listener to follow the form, then you certainly want them to hear that this is an important moment in the music. And it would be helpful at this point to do a couple of things as a composer. One is to establish the maximum amount of contrast, I would say, between the B theme and everything that preceded it. Just to make it as clear as possible that we are starting something new at this moment. The second thing would be to establish a certain amount of tension and a certain amount of instability, to create a sense that we're moving away from home. we're moving away from the A theme, and at the same time to generate an expectation that we will return later on, which happens in the recapitulation to come back to the A theme. Beethoven does both by manipulating the number of melodies present in the two themes. So if you look at the A theme, it contains just a single melody. There are two lines here, and I've got the lines color-coded. This is piano roll notation. If you've never seen it before, the rectangles are notes, and the height of the rectangles tells you the pitch of the notes. The blue line is a melody. This is the line that kind of stands out of the texture, really is in the foreground, whereas the other line, the red line, is more of an accompaniment. It's there in the background to kind of support the melody. So just one melody in that theme. But in the B theme, things change. Instead of just one melody, we have two simultaneously. We have a high-pitched melody, the blue line at the top of the texture, but we also have a second melody at the bottom of the texture in the lowest line. They're actually the same figure, and so it creates the sense that the one melody is imitating the other melody. And I would argue that by doing this, by introducing a second melody, at this point in the music, Beethoven has accomplished both of these goals. He's certainly created additional contrast, because not only are you getting a new theme, but you're adding a second melody to the texture. And I think that it also generates a certain amount of tension, because there's a sense of the melodies being in competition with one another, things are getting more complicated, and so forth. But how does this happen? Why is it that we hear the one line in the first theme, the two lines in the second theme as melodies, and we don't hear the other lines as melodies? What is it about them that makes them stand out, and the other ones are sort of in the background? Well, a lot of this seems to have to do with how repetitive, or more to the point, how non-repetitive the melodies are. People have done studies on this with big databases of music, and they found that the melodies in the classical style, at least, tend to be a lot less repetitive than the lines that accompany them. And we see that in both of these passages. If you look at the accompanying lines, this is the purple line and the yellow line in the B theme, they are highly repetitive. We don't need to hear the whole thing. It's just it's the same four-note pattern again and again and again throughout the passage. The accompanying, the melodies, however, are a lot less repetitive. So there's a larger variety of rhythmic values and pitches and so forth in the melodies, and creates more sense of interest, and that seems to be part of what causes the melodies to stand out from the accompaniments. We see the same thing in the A theme. The accompaniment is very repetitive, just alternating between two pitches, whereas the melody is a lot less repetitive. So the melodies tend to be less repetitive. That seems to be one of the things that distinguishes them. And this is quite interesting from the standpoint of auditory psychology, because we know that less repetitive sounds are a lot more likely to capture a listener's attention than repetitive sounds are. There have been a number of studies that have shown this in various ways. One really common situation is for subjects to be brought into a lab and asked to do some kind of a visual task. Usually they do something like read back a list of digits that they see on a computer screen. And they do this in the presence of distractor sounds of different types. And what they found in these studies is that subjects remember fewer digits. They do worse on the visual task when the distractor sounds are non-repetitive. In other words, non-repetitive sounds seem to capture more of the subject's attention and steal it away from the visual task. This is what psychologists refer to as the irrelevant sound effect. And I've got a couple examples of this. I've got a couple mock trials of this type of experiment. You're welcome to play along. You might want to get out your phone with the note app or a piece of paper because you're going to be asked to write down some digits as you see them. But there's going to be two of these trials. One of which is going to be accompanied by non-repetitive sounds, the melodies from the B theme and half beat that plays. And then the second one is going to be accompanied by repetitive sounds, the accompaniment from the B theme and half beat. And we can see if you do better on one than on another. So here is the first one. Everybody ready for the answer? There's, all right. Then the second one. Ready for the answer? How'd you do on these? It's a tricky task. If it's any consolation, I couldn't do these, and I made the demonstration. I couldn't memorize the list. But any easier with the second trial? A little easier to tune that out. I mean, it's hard to tell just from a couple of trials. But if we did this as a real experiment, we did dozens of these trials with all of you and collected data from all of you, what we would find is that you remembered more of the digits in the second case, when it was accompanied by non-repetitive sounds, because those are less likely to capture our attention. And the repetitive sounds are less likely to capture our attention. And the non-repetitive sounds take more of our focus away from the task. That's exactly the principle that's at work here, and it's exactly the principle that Beethoven used in those two passages I was just showing, to create the sense that we have two melodies that are capturing our attention and competing for our attention at that moment in music. So that's one technique that composers use to kind of signal where you are in the form. Another technique that's kind of related to this involves the melody breaking free from the lines that accompany it, almost ending a little solo. This is one that we see an example of in the Beethoven Opus 51 number 2, which, as I was saying before, is in rondo form. So it is based on an A theme that's stated at the beginning and then keeps coming back. But where we see this technique is a little bit later in the piece, and specifically in the shift from the B theme back to the first return of the A theme, and specifically in the passage that directly precedes the return of the A theme, which we usually refer to as the retransition back to the A theme. And this is another important moment in the form, because this is preparing the return of the A, and you want to really prime the listeners for that. And give them a sense that something big is coming, something they should be paying attention to is about to happen. And one of the ways that a composer might look to do that is to, again, generate some tension at this moment. Or more to the point, generate some energy. Create a sense that we are building towards something important. And that's exactly what Beethoven does by allowing the melody to break free from the accompaniment. So here's this passage. This is the return of the A theme right here. And what happens before is the retransition. And you'll notice that in the second half of the retransition, the melody, the blue line, becomes very active, a lot of notes. But the accompanying line becomes very inactive. There's just a single note sustained for the first half, and then at a certain point that note drops out. So the effect is really that the melody takes a solo, and moreover that it's building energy. It almost feels like so much energy has been built up at this point in the retransition. The melody just has to break free of the accompaniment in the last couple of bars before the A theme returns. Isn't a well-prepared return of an A theme. So that's another technique. A third technique composers often use, again, kind of related to this, involves taking the melody and splintering it apart, making the melody just a little incoherent for a moment. We see an example of this in the first rondo from the set, Opus 51, number 1, which is also on the program tonight. Again, it's in rondo form, so you have the A theme that keeps coming back, and you also have the B and the C themes that contrast with the A themes. And again, these are moments where it would make a lot of sense and be helpful to the listener if the composer generated a certain amount of contrast and a certain amount of tension. Make it clear that we're moving into a new theme and that we're moving away from home. We're moving away from the A theme, and you generate an expectation that you will return later on in the piece. Beethoven does that in both of these cases by allowing the melody to splinter apart. So here's the B theme. The melody is the blue line, and you'll notice that at a couple points in the melody, there are these little flourishes where the pitches get very far apart vertically. And the pitches are alternating, they're changing very quickly. And the effect of that is the melody sort of loses its coherence for just a moment. It almost feels like it's splitting into more than one line. So we see that in the B theme, and then we see an even more dramatic version of this effect in the C theme. There are these two spots in the melody where the pitches get really far apart, and they're changing really fast. Really hard to track that as just a single melody through those really fast arpeggios. But if you compare that to what happens in the A theme, it's very different. In the A theme, the melody is very coherent. The pitches are really close together. It's much easier to hear just a single line. So once again, Beethoven has done something that accomplishes both of these goals of creating contrast and tension. We have unsplit melodies that sound very coherent in the A theme, and then we have these melodies that kind of splinter apart in the B themes and the C themes. It certainly creates contrast, and also I think creates a sense of instability, as if the melodies are just about to break apart or something. And this effect, too, has its roots in auditory perception, and specifically in the process that we call auditory stream segregation, which is to say the way that we as human listeners make sense of really complex sound environments and parse complex sound environments into different perceptual streams. I used to live in New York City, and if you've ever been to New York City, you know it's a really noisy place. And more than that, it's a place where you're constantly hearing a huge variety of sounds. You're hearing taxis honking and other vehicles, the subway and pedestrians talking, and street vendors trying to sell you stuff, sirens. There's just all these different kinds of sound coming at you from every direction in a place like Manhattan. And if we were unable, as human listeners, to parse that kind of sound environment out into its constituent parts, we'd be in a lot of trouble. We wouldn't be able to function in a place like New York. And the way we do that is this process of auditory stream segregation, dividing the environment into streams that correspond to different sounds. And we know a lot about this, a lot of research. And one of the things that we know is that people are much more likely to separate tones into separate streams if the tones are far apart in pitch and if they are changing pitch quickly. In other words, if they're doing what the pitches in the B theme and the C theme were doing in the Beethoven a second ago. And I've got a demonstration to show this. So what you're going to be hearing in this psychoacoustical demo is an alternation of pitches. There's going to be high pitches alternating with low pitches. And as the alternation unfolds, it's going to get faster and faster. And the effect of this is that the demo will start out with you being able to hear just a single stream. You'll hear the alternation as just one stream of sound. And because you hear it as one stream, you're going to hear this galloping rhythm between the two pitches. Dee-doo-dee, dee-doo-dee, dee. You'll hear that gallop. But then at a certain point, the alternation is going to get so fast that it's going to become impossible to hear a single stream. And instead, what you'll hear is two parallel streams at these different pitches. And the galloping rhythm will disappear because you were hearing that as part. You're not hearing the two pitches as one stream. Now, if you're anything like me, you can't hear the gallop at all by the end of that demonstration. You're really hearing just two streams of sound. But compare that to a second version of the demo, where the pitches are closer together. And because they're closer together, you're actually going to be able to hear that throughout. You'll hear a single stream of sound from the beginning of the demo to the end, or at least you'll be able to if you try. And for that reason, you'll hear the gallop sustained right at the end. I don't know about you, but I can still hear the gallop at the end of that. Just barely, but I can still hear it. And so what we're seeing there is a demonstration that you have these two factors in place. You have the tones are far apart in pitch, and they're changing pitch really quickly. Then you hear two streams of sound. But if one or both of those factors is missing, then you don't. You hear a single stream of sound. And that's exactly the situation that we were seeing in the B theme and the C theme that we were just looking at, which is far apart and changing quickly, and it creates this effect of a split melody at this moment where you are looking at a lot of contrast and tension. But then we don't have that in the A theme. And in fact, like I said, we know a lot about auditory stream segregation at this point. There's been a lot of experiments on it. There's a lot of data out there on it. And we know so much, in fact, that it's become possible to derive a mathematical model from that data that enables us to make a prediction about how likely a person would be to hear one stream or multiple streams at the bottom of the top graph. And that's what we're seeing here in this plot. In the A theme, you see it's pretty likely that a listener is going to hear just one stream, much more likely than hearing multiple streams. And for that reason, we get this, we get an unsplit melody. But in the B theme and the C theme, it becomes much more likely that you hear multiple streams. And so we have this effect of the melody splintering apart just a little bit. So we can trace this, this cue to where we are when we form back to this part of technology. So we see that in this passage. There's also another example in the Pathétique Sonata in the first and the second movements. So I've been talking about form so far as something that happens just within a single movement. But you can also talk about form in the sense of how the movements connect together to form an entire work. And what we see in the Pathétique Sonata is that the first two movements have very different characters. The first movement is really fast and energetic and vigorous, whereas the second movement is much slower and more lyrical. And one of the ways that Beethoven creates this effect is by manipulating whether the melody splinters apart or not. And we get a little bit of what we were just seeing a second ago in the first movement. So if you look at the first movement here, the melody's pitches are, they're pretty close together, but not that close together. They're a little bit far apart. And because they're a little bit far apart, because of that, you have something of this effect of the melody splintering apart, not like you did in the other examples. And in fact, if you look at the mathematical model, it's kind of ambiguous. It's sort of halfway between, we hear one stream or two streams. But there's a sense of, it could almost split apart. And the melody, isn't quite clear. It's almost like a partial split. Whereas in the second movement of the Pathétique, things could not be more different. The melody's pitches are very close together. They're changing pitch very slowly. And because of that, you get a sense of a very connected, very coherent melody. And we see this in the graph. The model is unambiguous in the second movement, that you would certainly hear that line as one stream. So, in other words, Beethoven uses this property of auditory perception to create different characters that are appropriate to these two movements. In the first movement, he creates just a slight bit of instability in a sense that things are moving quickly and could break apart. Whereas in the second movement, he has this very, very connected melody that you never hear as anything other than a single stream, and is really appropriate to a more lyrical genre, such as the classical slow movement. And is also appropriate, it turns out, to an even more lyrical genre, the 70s love ballad. That is the song "This Night" by Billy Joel, and it literally, the chorus literally follows the opening of the Pathétique. Note for note. And yes, he does credit Beethoven as a co-songwriter in one. So Billy Joel gets credit for that. Anyway, that's another technique that you see in his composers using splintering the melody. And then there's a fourth technique that I'll talk about very quickly, which is sort of the opposite almost. It involves all of the lines coming together and being heard as a single unit. Instead of one line breaking apart, all of them coming together. We see an example of this in the Haydn variations that are on the program tonight. This is near the ending as we're kind of building up toward the ending. Again, this is a moment where it makes a lot of sense to build some energy, and that it'll be a signal to the listener that the ending is coming. We're building up toward the ending, and one of the ways that Haydn does that is by having all four of the lines come together and change pitches at the same time. So you can see the 4 lines here, they all start together at this point, and then when they change pitches, they all change pitches at the same time. And because of that, you don't get a sense so much of a melody plus 3 accompanying lines. It sounds like more melody that's just sort of supported from underneath, and the entire, the music just sounds like one stream of sound. And the effect, I think, is almost one of all of the voices coming together and cooperating as one to build energy for the ending. So this effect also can be traced back to auditory perception, to auditory stream segregation. Again, we know a lot about why people would hear simultaneous sounds as a single stream, like I'm suggesting in this passage. And we know that changing pitch at the same time is one of the biggest factors, that people are much more likely to hear things as one stream if they're changing pitch together. And I've got another demo of this. So this one's a little bit complicated. It's got 3 phases. It's going to start out with a low frequency tone, sustained. Then after a while, that tone is going to be joined by a block of upper tones. And these tones together, the low tone plus the block of upper tones, form the spectrum of a vowel, of the vowel oo. But you don't hear it because the 2 things have come in at different times. The low frequency tone comes in first, and it's joined by the overtones. You just hear 2 separate things. Sounds nothing like a vowel. But then what happens in the 3rd phase of the demo is they add a vibrato to it. In other words, all of the frequencies start changing pitch at the same time and in exactly the same way. And because they're doing that, you suddenly hear everything as a single stream of sound, and instead of hearing a lower tone and a block of upper tones, you hear a single vowel. Right together at that moment, and all of a sudden the sung vowel emerges. So that's what Haydn is doing in that.